welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share some very interesting Sasquatch encounters I found on the internet. These stories include a family in central Virginia who have had many sightings and encounters with what they believe to be multiple Sasquatches in their area, a scary encounter in Oregon where a group of people went out looking for what was responsible for a bizarre area that was cleared away in the wilderness, and sightings in northern Georgia and western North Carolina, where activity seems to be common and on the rise. But first, we start with a sighting in Alaska, where the original poster gives one of the better descriptions of a Sasquatch I've come across. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from Alaska, where the original poster, or OP, encountered what they believe to be a Sasquatch near Juneau in the summer of 2010. Juneau is the capital of Alaska and is located in the Gastineau Channel along the Alaskan Panhandle. It covers a total area of 3,254 square miles and has a population of 32,255 residents as of the 2020 census. The OP was at a Boy Scout camp at the time of his encounter, which was located on Eagle River outside of Juneau. He was 14 years old at the time. It was the last day of camp and they were playing a game called Find the Camp Counselors after having dinner. According to the OP, this is basically a hide-and-seek game where the counselors run out into the woods and hide, and the campers have to go find them. Summer days in Alaska are longer than usual, so there was still plenty of daylight left even though it was later in the day. The OP and his friend decided to stick together, so they headed out into the woods in search of the counselors. They eventually saw one hiding behind a tree and gave chase, but the counselor ran farther down a dirt road and around the bend, losing the two boys behind him. The OP and his friend decided to head back up the road toward the camp with the forest on their right and a field that was approximately 300 to 400 yards across on their left. On the other side of the field was the ocean. During their walk, the OP noticed a person walking up from the beach on the other side of the field. This struck him odd because it looked like the person was wearing a lot of dark clothing and it was a warmer day. He points out at this part of the story that the farther you walk along the road in the direction they were heading, the narrower the field becomes. The person he saw walking up from the beach was walking in the same direction they were, meaning they were getting closer the farther they walked. The OP kept an eye on the mysterious person, who was still about 200 yards away at this point, and the feeling came over him that something just wasn't right about who he was looking at. As the figure got closer, he realized what it was. The person was very tall. He and his friend kept a close watch on the being, and that's when the thought-to-be person changed course and started walking across the field. The boys guessed he was heading toward the forest and mountains beyond the far end of the field. After another few minutes, the person was close enough that the boys could definitely tell it was not a person. He points out here that between the ages of 13 and 14, he hit a growth spurt and grew to be 6 feet tall. The grass in the field came up to his waist and they were close enough to the figure to see that the grass only came up just barely above its knees. And it wasn't just that the creature was tall, but it was extremely muscular and covered in hair. He describes its head as being slightly cone-shaped and it having broad shoulders, and traps so big that they look like they connected to its head, giving the creature the appearance of not having a neck. It had abnormally long arms, with its hands almost reaching down to its knees. The being wasn't overly furry according to the OP, and had what he describes as extra shagginess around its head, shoulders, and upper back area. Its hair resembled that of a human, but at the same time it looked like it had a mane. He isn't sure if the creature caught their scent or not due to them being within 100 or so yards of it, but it took off running across the field with inhuman speed and disappeared into the forest in less than 10 seconds. This is what really caught the boys off guard, because it would have been impossible for them to match the speed of this being. They returned to camp and found the OP's cell phone, which they took back to the field to look for prints. They were able to find some and he took some pictures, but he no longer has that phone. He says that the footprints from this creature dwarfed his own foot, and he wore a size 13 shoe at the time. Once they took into account how tall the OP was at the time, the height of the grass, and where it came up to the creature, they estimated that it was about 8.5 feet tall. Since the encounter, the OP hasn't talked much about it, but his friend, who he is still close with, still does. He is glad he had his friend there with him when he saw the Sasquatch to confirm that he did indeed see it. The OP mentions that they didn't experience any feelings of dread or impending doom during their encounter. That is never a bad thing. It seems to me that they caught this Sasquatch en route from the beach back to the forest. But what an eerie scene that must have been to see what they thought was a person only to get closer and realize that it wasn't a person at all, and just how big this creature was. Also, we have another account that details how fast these creatures are. This seems to be the case for almost all cryptids. This is also one of the best descriptions I've heard, as they got a close look at the Sasquatch in full daylight. It leaves little doubt to me that this was a Sasquatch. What do you think? The next story comes from Central Virginia. The original poster doesn't say where exactly, just that he lives in Spotsylvania County in the central part of the state. He details the being or beings that his girlfriend's brother saw and what he saw crossing the road one night. This all comes after he clicked on a random YouTube video one night and went down the rabbit hole of Sasquatch sightings. I think all, or at least most of us, can relate to that. I know I can. And if you randomly click this video, welcome to the beginning of your journey. Well, just as it happens, his girlfriend's family has had some experience with what they think could be more than one Sasquatch. They all live in very rural areas of Virginia. The sighting he heard about happened to his girlfriend's brother. He was out off-roading with his friends one night when his friend yelled and took a tumble out of the Jeep. Her brother slowed down to stop, but his friend came running up, yelling at them to keep driving because he saw something very big on two legs running through the Jeep's headlight as they were driving. He said it was about 8 to 9 feet tall. The brother never saw anything, but he has seen some things out in those woods at night. According to the OP, the brother refers to what he has seen as they and describes them as being very thin and not hairy. He has seen them 3 or 4 times, and from what he can tell, they kill and eat deer in the area. About a month and a half after he heard about his girlfriend's brother's encounter, it was Christmas Day and he had gone with his girlfriend to visit her family. After a nice day of spending time with the family, they left at around 6 p.m., which, being December, it was already dark out. They set out for home, and after driving for about 15 to 20 minutes, they drove around a curve to see a foot in the headlights. The light then lit up a leg and the back of this huge creature. The OP says it was about 9 feet in height, and the foot's heel was on one side of the double yellow line, with its toes and the ball of its foot well on the other side. What caught him off guard the most and made him slam on his brakes was the fact that in walking from right to left crossing the road, the creature made it from the yellow line to the shoulder in just one stride. It was moving so fast that the headlights only lit up its legs, back, and shoulders, but not its face. He ends his post with 2 questions. In the first, he asks if anyone knows what his girlfriend's brother has seen in the woods, and his second question asked if Central Virginia is a hotbed for Sasquatch activity. As for the first question, the way the brother describes the creatures as being very thin and not hairy, it doesn't make me think Sasquatch. This makes me think crawler. But cryptids have been known to kill and eat deer and other wildlife, so that could fit for both. But Sasquatch are usually described as being muscular, broad, and very hairy, even the juveniles. As for what the brother's friends saw and what the OP saw himself, I do think they saw a Sasquatch. The descriptions match. As for Central Virginia being a hotbed for activity, I don't know for sure, but it seems to be the case. I see and hear quite a few stories coming from there. But it doesn't just seem to be Sasquatch in the area. That's just a guess on my part though, but the very thin, not hairy creatures the brother saw seem to point to this being the case. I would definitely keep a close eye on my surroundings and be careful. What do you think the very thin, not hairy creatures the brother described seeing are? And what do you think the OP and the brother's friends saw during their sightings? The next story is actually two stories in one. The first is from the original poster, with the second being from a commenter in reply to the original. The first story takes place near Jasper and Dawsonville, Georgia, with both towns being in the northern part of the state and approximately 22 miles from each other. The OP's wife had taken their dog out for a walk when she saw a Sasquatch staring at her from approximately 25 yards away. It was standing perfectly still behind two trees. She was able to see its head and face between the trees and describes the head as being wide and the creature as having blue eyes. She stood there watching it for about 2 minutes before deciding to leave the area. She returned to the spot 10 minutes later, but the Sasquatch was gone. She told her husband that the being didn't move and made no sound whatsoever. Also, there was no smell. She also says she didn't feel threatened by the Sasquatch at all. The creature was approximately 6 feet in height, making her and her husband believe it was a juvenile. The OP says this is very exciting for him because he sometimes hears loud knocks around his home when he is leaving for work at about 4:30 in the morning. Her sighting just confirms for him what he already thought was around their home. The second story takes place in the mountains near Franklin, North Carolina, which is located in the Nantahala National Forest in the western part of the state. Franklin is less than 2 hours away from Dawsonville, Georgia. The poster of the story says there have been multiple Sasquatch sightings in the area, and there have been weird occurrences where boulders have been moved overnight. One of the men who claims to have seen a Sasquatch in the area owns a timber company near Franklin. He was at his company one evening when rocks and sticks were thrown at him. It was just after sunset and already too dark to see, so he pulled his flashlight out and shined it in the trees. He saw something large and brown moving away from him through the trees. He is an avid bear hunter and says what he saw definitely was not a bear. The person who told this second story then says that one night they were sitting outside of their home when they heard coyotes howling somewhere close by. Then they heard several loud tree knocks followed by a guttural whooping sound. The coyotes went silent and he decided it was time to get back inside. He ended his story by saying he thinks there are a lot of Sasquatch in the Appalachian Mountains. The OP of the first story replied and said they are all over the mountains near where he lives in Georgia. Northern Georgia and western North Carolina seem to be hotspots for Sasquatch activity, and they certainly have a lot of untamed natural areas to roam around in, with so many national forests and the Appalachian Mountain Range in both areas. Both of these stories sound like Sasquatch to me, especially with the throwing of rocks and sticks and the tree knocks and whooping. Those are both telltale signs of Sasquatch activity. It's not the first time I've heard of Sasquatch and cryptid activity in these areas of these two states, but I definitely think that in these two cases it was a Sasquatch. What do you think? The final story of this episode comes from Oregon. The original poster was near Eugene, Oregon when his encounter took place in August of 2013. The OP had traveled down to the area with a friend who he refers to as A to visit their family. While spending time with A's cousin, who he refers to as B, the topic of Sasquatch came up. B then told them about an odd occurrence that took place while on a camping trip. On the way home, B was on the passenger side of the vehicle when he saw an odd-looking area off the road. B had the driver pull over and they went down to the spot to have a look around. When they got to the area, they immediately noticed that all the ground cover had been cleared away. They also found a pit in the area. Intrigued, the OP asked B if he would take him and his friends to the spot and show them what he found. B agreed, and the next day the OP, his friend A, the cousin B, and a few other people went to check out the spot. The day was overcast and it was raining, but it wasn't a hard rain, so it was bearable. It wasn't a popular area either, so they didn't have to worry about running into a bunch of people there. When they arrived, the OP and B ventured down to the area, and just as B had told them the day before, all the ground cover had been cleared away. There was indeed a large pit dug into the ground with 4 large ash trees laying across it. The OP points out here that ash trees do grow in the area, but down a very steep incline near a creek. He also says that the trees laying across the pit were not small at all, which would have made them hard to move, and they looked like they had been snapped like toothpicks. There were no marks or signs of damage caused by a storm to explain how they could have been broken, other than them looking like they were snapped like twigs. While the OP was looking at the area and taking pictures, he heard something walking somewhere below the area. He turned to get B's attention, but he had already started back up the trail. The OP wasted no time following him back up the trail to the road. While walking back toward the road, the OP and B heard a very large tree knock that sounded more like a large branch or tree being slammed into another tree. They hurried back up the trail and met up with the rest of the group, all of whom remained within eyesight of each other. As the group stood at the road talking about what happened, they heard something moving on the hill above them. The OP describes it as bipedal, very large, and remaining just out of sight. He and A decided to walk over to the hill to see if they could spot whatever it was moving around up there. Being that he was excited at the chance to see a Sasquatch in person, the OP traversed the hill a lot quicker than his friend. They had hiked before, and when they couldn't see each other, they would whistle to communicate and find each other. He noticed then that A was no longer in view, so he stopped and whistled. A responded from behind, but he was not the only one to respond. Deeper into the woods, coming from the same direction as A, he heard another whistle. An uneasy feeling immediately came over him, and he began making his way back toward his friend and the road. He eventually met back up with A, and he showed the OP a game trail where all the overhanging branches had been pushed back and a metal marker along the trail had been twisted and bent so it was now pointed away from the trail. This only made the uneasy feeling grow worse, and he wanted nothing more than to be off that hill and leave the area far behind. They continued back down toward the road, but came out of the woods farther away from the car than when they entered. The OP walked at a normal pace, but his friend took his time walking back to the car. When the OP made it to the car, he looked back at his friend to see him on the side of the road looking down at something. He mentions here that A does not run, ever, so it caught the OP off guard when his friend turned and ran to the car as fast as he could. He told the OP while he was walking he heard something in the bushes on the other side of the road. He went to take a look, and that's when he heard the sharp hiss of a cat, like the sound it makes when it's mad. Only he said it wasn't a cat, just something mimicking a cat. Freaked out, he turned and ran back to the car. They left shortly thereafter. In the years that have passed since his encounter, the OP has heard a lot of stories about weird experiences in and around the area near Eugene, Oregon, where his encounter took place. I've also heard a lot of cryptid stories coming from Oregon. It's another one of those states that has certain areas known for cryptid activity. This one seems to me like a Sasquatch because of the way the OP describes the trees being snapped in half like toothpicks. Not only that, but the tree knock fits too. And I've recently learned that Sasquatch can mimic voices too, so it isn't out of the realm of possibilities to assume it was a Sasquatch that made the hissing sound. The OP's friend didn't say for sure if he saw anything or not, so this could have been a cougar, which are common in the state. He definitely acted like he knew it was something else making the hissing noise according to the way the OP told the story. What do you think they encountered that day? And what do you make of the cleared area and the pit? That one, especially the pit, has me scratching my head. And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.